Hello, everyone. This is the March 30th meeting of the Service Mesh Interface Community meeting. We don't seem to have a large agenda here, so I'll open the floor to anybody if they have something they want to talk about.
The main thing for me, I think, is your PR looked on for service identity was looking pretty well advanced. How's that getting on? Did you manage to speak with Stefan and just kind of allay some of his concerns?
Yep, he was fine since he didn't realize that the schemes were going to be orged together. So with that clarification, he was fine with the implementation as is. The spec is going to, just for, I guess, full safety purposes, you're going to make pot label selector and service account mutual exclusive anyway, just because, why would you want to do that in the first place? But
I think it's edge. Yeah, I don't see that as a problem.
Yeah. So had two approvals between you and Stefan. I made a small change to only allow a single pot label selector. At one point, it was originally I had it for multiple selectors. Thinking about it deeper, I was like, there's not really a need for multiple sets of selectors, because then the semantics of that get weird if you're going to AND them or going to OR them, and it's not really necessarily in this. I can't think about.
I think you can work. Yeah, I think you can work around that with the pod label selectors themselves. So the argument that I can think of is that you may have like V1, V2, because you kind of want to do something like that. But I think ultimately you can get around that by making sure your V1 pod and your V2 pod has a common label on which you use as a selector.
Which you would do probably anyway.
Right.
That's practice. So I felt pretty good about that change. Like, if there's a really compelling reason, we could always go back and expand that. It's not too big of a change to take a list of selectors versus a single one, but I think we're good. So I made that change. The settings for the repo dismissed stale reviews since there's a new commit added. So yeah, that always gets me. So I'm gonna need 2 more reviews, but since I got 2 reviews at one point with the state of the spec and the change wasn't too big of one, I've gone ahead and started the implementation in the controller SDK for generating CRDs. I've added validating webhooks just because I didn't want to ship identity binding without the mutual exclusive pieces of service account and pot label selector. So that's fairly well in hand. I'm working on the validating webhooks right now, but as far as the CRD generation is fine. This is my first time spending doing a lot with Kube Builder, so it's been a great learning experience. And so I think I should have a PR for that up, crossing fingers, by our next community meeting. That should
be the validating webhooks. So there's 2 ways to do with Kube Builder. You can do validating webhooks, and that's kind of like the one thing. But I think actually you might just get by with just using the validation
markers. Yeah.
I think that the built-in open API validation is probably going to be enough to cover this bit of the spec.
The problem with that is that the Kube Builder currently doesn't support one of validations with Open API spec. So I'm using a combination. So I've got one kind of 2 layers, one of just the regular API validations, making sure, you can only, I set it so you can only specify, you have a minimum of 1 scheme and a maximum of 2, just to, a surface level validations, as well as uniqueness was disabled, but just basic stuff like that in the Open API spec, required fields, things like that. And then I'm doing validating webhooks for that mutually exclusive bit, as well as validating the kind of the Spiffy Go library has a validate Spiffy ID function. But I'm going to add just to make sure the Spiffy identities that are specified are valid for any trust domain. just make sure it's a valid ID. I think that will help adoption, knowing that there's a smaller possibility of foot guns with those validations present in the webhooks. So
Nice.
that's almost, like I said, 70% done. Just putting the final pieces on it. And then, like I said, I should have a PR up by our next community meeting with that. So we at that point, I'll be able to just once the control SDK gets approved, I'll be able to to copy the CRDs and such to the SMI SDK Go library just for back compatibility. And I think I'll transfer it for that backwards compatibility, and then we can consider identity binding landed, and I'll be using that with the STO controller, and that'll be where a good bit of my SMI time will be moving forward, is putting that identity binding into use.
And I'll implement that in the console controller too. So that we'll at least have two solidified implementations by the time the PR. I've just done my approval as well, again, on, like, there was no real changes from the last time, other than, as you said, like a commit, a minor commit. Yeah, that's awesome. With regard to OSM, what I don't know, I'm gonna have to apologize for my ignorance. What's the sort of the situation around OSM and identity? Is there will it be possible to get sort of adoption and the implementation from OSM around? I know they're not using the new controller SDK, but the other stuff is there. It should be possible still to implement.
Yeah, I've posted about it internally. Hasn't gotten a ton of visibility, but I can talk to my manager about what it would look like to adopt it. Since service account is so limiting, I know there was at one point a desire to get Spiffy implemented in OSM. So I think identity binding moves is a positive in that regard. So I'll see if I can't push for adoption internally for that.
Yeah, I think with console, with the Spiffy implementation, we support regex as well. Is that correct?
On for Spiffy specifically,
Well, it wouldn't be regex, I suppose. It maybe globbing or something like that. So you
like glob wildcards, yeah. I don't think it's explicitly it's not explicitly specified in the spec, but it's not, excuse me, it's not explicitly disallowed in the spec. So there's some ambiguity there.
I'm just thinking the Spiffy identity with, I'm pretty sure the Spiffy identity in console is a unique identity. Michael probably know better, but I'm pretty sure it's a unique identity per service instance, which conforms to the kind of the URI syntax. So you would have, like, I don't know, api.datacenter.something/GUID. And that's kind of how our Spiffy identities work. They are unique, but they kind of, so I think if we were to allow Spiffy, would have to have a glob, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to, without looking, I can't exactly remember, but I think other people might have that issue as well, that you either prefix the unique service instance ID or you postfix it.
Yeah, I would have to look more closely at that. I think that also kind of ties into a question I had about, like, how we would be considering for, like, the HTTP root adoption potential of, like, matching that, or like pairing that with identity binding, basically, like, for the use case of, like, splitting V1 and V2 services. And this kind of ties into, like, some of, like, the review questions you had on identity binding around, like, should a V1 and V2 of logically the same service, or like a blue-green deployer, do commit SHA or whatever, use the same identity binding, or should it not? And the pros of it of not having that logic identity binding is that we could use HTTP root to handle like the traffic splitting and the waiting load balancing between them. So I don't know if I don't know where that logic should live, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call. I think in general, it opens up a question around variance, because theoretically, like your service identity is like, say, API, and then you have a subset. So you could use service identity to basically do a selection of services based on, like, you could use Spiffy ID and pod selector or something to kind of subset services. Or should we think about the introduction of a more granular subset? Like what makes more sense for the end user? I'm pretty sure, like the way that Istio does it through a service definition, where you define a subset as part of a service definition. Console does it through a service resolver, which is a similar construct where you
I'm hesitant to think about identity binding in the context of subsetting V1, V2, simply because the main focus of that resource is for policy setting in authorization. So I would think if you've got two subsets of a service, they should still, you wouldn't want, this thing can't talk to, it can't talk to this service because it's V1 or V2. I feel like that would be handled.
Same identity, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same identity. You would handle that with like a header or some kind of query parameter or something else besides identity. It's the same thing. I will say that OSM has a CRD for it's called upstream traffic setting, and that starts to introduce. It's because currently SMI does not have like a load balancing setting resource. Like there's no way of encompassing like a destination service resolver in console or a destination rule in Istio. Like those resources kind of, okay, once they handle, okay, once the traffic has been routed to a particular destination, a particular cluster of sorts, then, what do you do? How do you load balance traffic to those hosts? How do you handle circuit breaking? How do you handle traffic? Traffic split would kind of be on the routing side, but there's not currently a place for that. I think as far when it comes to SMI resources, I wonder if that shouldn't live in traffic split or HTTP route. Speaking of the gateway resources, I think maybe HTTP route should possibly allow you to specify different subs. You can have a target subset in the HTTP route, but then your destination service resolver upstream traffic setting, that resource should say, here are the subsets that I recognize that you can route to. So I think it's separate than an identity problem.
So so if we kind of make an assumption that we go down the HTTP root group API gateway spec as a kind of a solution, that just uses destination. Is that correct, Mike? And destination is like a loose thing, isn't it? Where we were saying that actually destination could be service identity. So how do you know how you would handle like a traffic split with HTTP root group without looking? I don't know. I would have to.
So I added a comment on your GitHub issue about this, kind of like explaining some of my thoughts on it. And basically, if we're using it for permissions, we're basically proposing to use it in sort of an inverse way of how the Gateway API uses it. So for like splitting into multiple backends and like potentially waiting between them. You would backend ref is what has those kind of semantics built into it. And you can have multiple backend refs. So multiple destinations are possible, and you can specify the weights in between them of how they should be split there.
And what is backend ref? Is backend ref from just, I'm just looking into this. It's just like name and port. So it's a very loose reference.
So it can point to any Kubernetes object. So the backend refs field can point to any Kubernetes object.
Okay.
So instead of pointing to a like gateway API backend ref that references a Kubernetes service, kind of the default one there. On console, we've already created our own like console mesh service as an alternate the backend ref can point to. We could instead do something similar with identity binding, pointing to an identity binding as a backend ref, and you can point to one or more depending on how we want to handle it.
But if you wanted a subset, so I mean, I'm thinking if you wanted a subset, backend ref is fine, because then you could just do a pod. And does it have selector criteria? Again, I'm looking. I'm not the doc. I'm gonna have to open the doc.
Sounds like there'd have to be an object, like a resource that backend ref refers to, and that resource would have to have the selector.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you basically pointed at a deployment, for example, rather than pointing at a pod selector.
Well, if you're doing traffic splitting, you'd have to have, I would think you'd have to have different Kubernetes services for each version, right? Like you wouldn't want to Robin across versions. That kind of defeats the purpose of a V1.
Yeah, I don't. I'm just trying to kind of like work out which.
There's like a few different points at which you could do the split, or
couldn't it be all of the above? Because then I'm thinking then maybe the way that maybe we take a different slant on things, in that you kind of the HTTP route group as it stands for, my screen just flashed, sorry. HTTP route group as it stands for us right now, we would get rid of. You would keep traffic target, and you would just have to have some like, well, it wouldn't be an implied check, but the routing configuration, if you've got no if you don't have a traffic target between two, clearly defined between two services, then it's just not going to work. There's not going to be any traffic configuration. So how would you do that? Like in terms of like traffic access?
I think there's danger in trying to like use identity binding for anything outside of policy, like outside of policy.
Like I'm just trying to, I was kind of more around the, like in our world, and that's absolutely fine. But I'm just trying to think like, because of the way that kind of HTTP route works in terms of the V2 networking, it's it's got fields like the parent ref and the backend ref, which are at a different level of encapsulation from the way that HTTP route group in SMI works. So you end up with like, could you, because then a traffic target references a route group, sorry, and a traffic target is.
I see what you're saying. So there's some like ability between HTTP route and traffic, and how traffic target thinks of things.
Yeah, because like when you want to configure a traffic access, you might want to configure a traffic access which is L7 based, and that makes perfect sense. So in the current world, that works fine with the route group and stuff like that. But if we adopt HTTP route, then ideally you're kind of like your traffic access is going to reference a gateway networking HTTP route, and it's all a bit, it's all a bit backward then. So I don't have an answer for that right now, but
I think it would help. I think it would help me if there was like a concrete implementation to look at, whether that's like a unit test, conformance test, or something of like how these work, to see like what a swap might look like at like an actual technical implementation level.
Yeah, I think the way I see it in my head, I think if we had like, this is the proposed world and this is the native configuration representation, that would probably work. Because I think it could be challenging to shoehorn the two together. Squeeze. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I think one of the issues is that HTTP route group in SMI is currently serving two purposes. One is traffic splitting, the other is authorization policy, and that coupling makes it difficult to try to evolve anything, because they're really two separate roles.
And I think decoupling that is a good thing.
I agree completely. So like the STO manifest for authorization policy, you inline the what's called query params, path, and like that, the operation, the HTTP verb, that's all inline to your policy, and you don't have to go and figure and look at a different resource to figure out what you're looking at. We mentioned readability in the last meeting. I think that that developer experience is more readable. I wonder if that's something we should consider, because they kind of get the two roles split between policy and traffic routing, and then we're free to evolve the traffic routing piece as we want to be more robust.
Like at the moment, my brain says you're right on that, and that the only real way we can move forward is that I think we get rid of like HTTP route group in favor of the V2 networking. That makes sense, I think. But I think what we have to do is, because we're thinking purely about access policy, I don't think we can reference a V2 networking route route as part of access policy. I think we need just a simplified way of defining the access rules. And I think you're right, like just the way that Istio and both console do it is exactly the same, as that you just inline the paths and you set the allow criteria. And I think that would work for most things. And then that way we've got a really nice way of defining policy-based identity. And then we're saying for anything else like routing, V2 networking.
Yeah, I always love breaking tight coupling where it doesn't make sense. And I think this gives us a much larger degree of freedom to evolve both problem sets of traffic, of access policy and traffic routing.
Yeah, and like at a later date, like it'd be interesting to see what V2 networking does around policy. I know there is talk of something happening at some point.
It is very out there and underspecified currently. So
yeah. So I mean, we can always like specs evolve, and I think that's a key thing. It's like, we should have opinions which are held weekly. So if and when, let's just change it. Like, I think that's just progress, right? So I think we've got a good solution here that could work for everything and get us to beta 1.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think we're talking about moving, making a breaking change to beta, and like if there's going to be a time to do this kind of thing, it's now when breaking changes are allowed. So I think that all works. I agree with Mike that it makes sense to put together kind of a reference implementation of what this would look like.
Yeah.
And get a doc going. I think that's kind of the natural evolution of your issue, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's going to help convince folk as well.
Yeah,
if it's like clearly explained, it's like, well, look, this is the input, this is the output. Security is fine, routing and all of that functionality is preserved, and we're good to go.
All right. So what an action item for me that I'll take is I'll start a document, at least I'll commit to at least creating it by our next meeting, to kind of just hold. I kind of see this as like SMI v next, where we're talking about, this is our push toward beta. There are a lot of different initiatives between identity binding and adding Union V2 networking and changing traffic target to your HTTP route group. I think it makes sense to have maybe if it's just a top level document that links out to other documents eventually, but we need a collection to be able to hold all the different things that we're wanting to do moving to beta.
It's so nice to get this done for like KubeCon Europe as well, that we can actually have the beta and we've got the reference implementations, and I think that would be super cool.
Do we have, I didn't see it on the schedule. I don't think does SMI have like a office hours there?
Well, so I don't know, maybe Bridget knows best on this, but from my understanding, every project in the CNCF used to have a slot or a session. Now, I just don't know is the answer, but it would be a really great opportunity to kind of talk about the spec moving forward and kind of getting to a pretty good milestone and completeness.
Yeah, I agree. We are right at the end of March. And so I think I'm glad we switched, or not switched, we added these extra meetings, because I think they're helpful to me, at least, for having these checkpoints moving for the progress moving forward. So I'll make that doc. I should be wrapped up with the I should be wrapping up the implementation of identity binding. I might end up letting that PR sit for a bit. I think the important thing I'm going to focus my time on is helping with that doc to talk about the proposal, the design for SMI beta.
I mean, like realistically, if we're making good progress, why we could make a decision that actually the service identity PR just goes into beta 1. It's like the first commit on beta 1, and then we roll that up with the PRs and commits around how the V2 networking and changes to traffic access, because then we can literally just bundle all of that up and then do that one-shot release where the controller changes, the spec makes the big jump, and then actually the move to, it kind of makes the adoption of service identity in some ways easier, because we're already saying we were going to introduce this like halfway house where you can still use service account, but then you can also specify service identity. If we just roll that commit into beta, then we can just make it a breaking change and just say that, look, it is just service identity now. There's no alternatives, and I think that just makes things cool. It's simpler.
Yeah,
Simpler, yes, but I feel like there's a risk of like leaving prior adoptees of the spec behind. And I think like that's the big risk we try to like break too much going into beta.
Well, I mean, you can always still kind of keep rolling along with sort of alpha 5. I think the the security models doesn't change there. I don't think it's any weaker with the current implementation. But I agree with you. Like, I don't know, like maybe we need like Jared and a few other folks to kind of chime in on. Maybe we should float that as just a question or an issue and just say, look, hey, this is something we're thinking on. Thumb it up or thumb it down, and let's have a vote.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, where I stand is probably I think we need to at minimum backport on the anti-binding to V1 Alpha 4 for
Okay.
even if only for signaling purposes, that we're not abandoning alpha of the spec, that like there's still a path forward. Adopt the anti-binding, feel it out for your use case, and then come join us in beta 1.
But we might as well just merge it then. Then I think as soon as the controller stuff is ready, we might as well just merge it as Alpha 4. I mean, I'm not against it. I'm just trying to think of less work of different, releasing the controllers and SDKs and stuff like that. So, okay. Either way is good. It's progress.
It is, yeah. Like I said, I'll take the action item of making that doc, and I'll share it in. Go ahead and put it in maybe both Slack channels, SMI and the core maintainers channel, just to get as many eyes on this as possible, because this is it is a big break and change. You're pushing towards beta, so want to get as high visibility as we can, and then I'll be doing some more filling it out with help from you two, of course, and anybody else.
So then what I might do is I think it's a good idea to kind of get that separation. So I think I'll update the issue with kind of some further thoughts around, we're thinking, like X networking is not going to be involved with, it's not going to touch access policy. This is the idea of how we're going to handle layer 7 capabilities around that. Still means the deprecation of HTTP and UDP root group, but we're going to kind of modify traffic access to include these selection criteria around paths and routes. And then I can raise a PR for that, but that's going to be like a beta 1 PR, because that is a bad, it's a breaking change. So we cannot introduce that as an Alpha 5, really.
Sounds like a plan.
Dope. I'm excited.
Right. I'm very excited.
Are you both coming to KubeCon in Valencia?
I'm kind of in between. I was in between employers and stuff when the tickets and stuff were available, so I'm probably not gonna be able to make this one, but I hope to start coming to more KubeCon events.
So LA, is it going to be LA? I don't know where it's going to be, actually. No, it's not LA. It was LA last time.
It's in Detroit this year, Detroit, Michigan.
Oh, okay.
For the
winter. Well, I don't like going cold places in the winter. I might not be there.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately not going to make it to Valencia, but I am hoping to get out to the North America one.
I'm going to come to Detroit because I've always wanted to go to Detroit. So like, there's a good excuse. All right, cool. Well, let's figure that out, and then we'll figure out the session, whether it's maybe a virtual Q&A type thing, or whether there is going to be a provision. I don't know how the CNCF is handling that now that the number of projects has expanded from what it was previous.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you all. We'll see you next time.
See you soon. Later.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.